Politics can be best defined as the pursuit of power. Once an ideology has achieved power, it will use this power for the good of their society, of course. But what good means will depend a lot on the ideology. However, the end goal of most ideologies is the success of their societies. But this brings us to the essential question: what makes a society successful? This essay will be my personal answer to this most vital of all political questions, which I will call social parasite theory. The first step, however, is to ask, what do I mean by success? When I talk about a successful society, I mean a society that is capable of overcoming the problems that they will inevitably face. In other words, a society that is resilient is a successful society. This is also very convenient because when we look at things this way, it is easy to tell the societies that are successful from those that are not. Those that are not resilient and cannot overcome their problems will decline and inevitably collapse. Unsuccessful societies are no more than ruins, like in the case of the Romans, or are in the slow and painful process of collapsing, such as in Haiti. On the other hand, the societies that are in fact not collapsing and are even growing are by definition successful. So we can conclude that most societies today are successful. However, it is not always clear if this country is in a state of decline, stability, or growth. However, that judgment is not ours to make. Instead, history itself will decide the outcome in a century or so. And so we can only know for sure once we see from hindsight. With this definition out of the way, let us get into the actual question of this essay. What does the ascent or decline of a society depend on? Of course, the fortunes of a society depend on the hundreds of factors such as weather, natural resources, neighbors, local flora and fauna, and many other factors that interact with each other in ways that are not always obvious. But I think that it is a mistake to see the development of a society in a deterministic manner, as academics often do, because a society is not an algorithm made up of a stack of factors. A society is made up of people. And how simple would everything be if humans were just rational, predictable algorithms? Material factors are no doubt important, but they are not deterministic. Instead, what I do believe to be far more important to the success of a person's life is his character. A person is his actions, and in turn, a person's actions are the manifestation of his character. If we think about individual success, we cannot really say that it is deterministic. It is very often the case that the people from the most humble beginnings turn out to be far more successful than the spoiled children of rich families, despite their radically different beginnings. But to go beyond economics, the success of a life also depends on having good friends and living surrounded by the people who love you. And all of those depend on your character, since you can't really buy love or friendship. In the short term, a person's character is not deterministic. There are more than enough honest and diligent people that find themselves in terrible situations. But in the long run, I firmly believe that character is destiny, that the spoiled rich kid will sooner or later lose everything, even if this whole process takes generations, and that the honest, hard-working man will overcome adversity in this generation or the next. This is a belief that comes from my life experience. I cannot prove it to you mathematically, but I think that most people will recognize in their lives they value character above all else. True friendships and romantic love are based only on mutual admiration for each other's character. And at work, we value a person's reputation far more than their CV. Yet character is often ignored in sociological matters because it refuses to be put inside of a calculator. Since it cannot be measured, it is strictly unscientific and therefore dismissed despite the huge role that it plays in our very unscientific and very human lives. A person's character is the true wildcard that frustrates materialist determinism. If we can agree on the great importance that individual character plays in our small daily lives, why can we not take the same concept and apply it to society as a whole? After all, a society is made up of nothing other than millions of people, and the sums of millions of individual characters makes up the character of a society. At least in my opinion, this is the most important factor in the success of a society, and it is ignored because it simply cannot be measured. Why is it that Japan is wealthy, has low crime, and the trains run on time? Possibly, perhaps, it has something to do with the fact that during the World Cup, only the Japanese spectators systematically picked up their own trash. Only national character is able to explain events that seem unlikely and even impossible from the determinist point of view. For example, how can we explain the rise of the Roman Republic, a state initially composed of a single city, to total domination of the Mediterranean? Clearly, if geography and wealth were the true keys to national success, then it would not make sense that a poor, rural city-state would triumph against the established empires of Carthage and Macedon. But yet, against all odds and despite many catastrophes, the citizen soldiers of Rome were victorious. So much so that everything here is written in their alphabet. Due to their national character, the Romans of the early and middle republic were stubborn, hardy, and honor-obsessed. The best example of this was their resilience during the Second Punic War, after suffering terrible defeats against Hannibal. In a span of 20 months, they lost 20% of all their men above 17 years old. To put this into perspective, that would be the equivalent of the United States losing 25.83 million men in less than 2 years of war. But despite these casualties, they would not give up, and they raised new legions that were eventually triumphant under the command of Scipio. In this case, their national character has led them to victory. If we go forward 600 years to the fall of the Roman Empire, we have exactly the opposite case. The empire was on paper the strongest state around, but despite this, it was ripped to pieces. The Romans changed a lot in 600 years, and late Rome was defined by inner turmoil, treason, and the execution of the best men that the empire had, Stilicho, Aetius, and Majorian. Indeed, if we look at only geography and material factors, the Roman Empire had no reason to collapse in the way that it did, but the late Romans were a shadow of their former selves. By the end, the empire's legions were not even Roman, they were mostly Germanic, because the Romans were not even willing to fight, and the average Roman citizen, who once was the backbone of the Republic, was forced into serfdom. The empire ended with a pathetic whimper because of many factors, but almost all of them can be attributed to the decadence of their human capital, the terrible leadership, the class stratification and serfdom, the constant civil wars, and the unwillingness to defend their own homeland. This decadence was not as pronounced in the east of the empire, which lived on until the same factors caught up with it a few centuries later, and there we would see the rise of another small nation-state to world dominance, that is, the Ottomans. But I think that I will leave it here since I believe that I have made my point. I took the example of the Roman Empire because I think it is a perfect illustration of how the destiny of nations depends on the character of their people. But I think that it is much more important to make these concepts more concrete. So, what do I mean by human capital, and what does it have to do with national character? Human capital is the value that a person has to society. We can say that there are people who give more to society than they take, and conversely, there are those who take more than they give. And by this, I'm not only talking in economic sense. You can be very financially productive and still be a net negative to society by being a selfish asshole, by neglecting your children, or by selling things that harm society. Indeed, you could have a very wealthy society that falls due to its own internal problems. Indeed, I think that we are going to see many cases like this in the coming decades. More on that later. Of course, we all live through periods of being a net negative to society, such as childhood and retirement. But when you add it all together, there are people who gave more and others that took more. Hosts and parasites. If a society has more hosts than parasites, everything will be fine. There will be more than enough goods for everybody to have, and social trust will remain high. But when there are more parasites than hosts, then things start to get interesting. Since parasites do not produce enough to cover what they take from society, both in money and in social capital, A society made up of only parasites would immediately collapse, since at a certain point there would not be enough to go around, social trust would wither away, and people would not be able to plan for the long term. Since parasites do not cover their own needs, parasites need hosts to survive. Therefore, the balance of host to parasites in a society is essential for the success of a nation. You individually cannot tabulate this, but what is tangible is the effects that this balance has. Before the microscope, we could not observe bacteria, but the resulting infection would be clearly visible, despite all the bacteria being invisible. The same applies, I think, to the host-to-parasite ratio, the HPR. We cannot measure if a person does more for society than he takes away, but in the millions the effect is very visible. A nation where there are 90 hosts to every 10 parasites will be very productive and successful. For every piece of trash that a person throws out of the window, 9 other people would pick it up. The inverse scenario, however, would not be very nice to look at. To take a very real example, let's look at Mexico and see the HPR there. I think that Mexico is a very interesting case because they have very productive hosts and very nasty parasites. The parasites are well known. The narcos who provide Mexico with some 30,000 murders per year, the corrupt politicians that steal even the chemotherapy from children's hospitals, I kid you not, and the prevalence of obesity and alcoholism, etc. The hosts are well less known. The Mexican worker works an average of 2,226 hours per year, the second highest in the world. That is 400 more hours than the American worker and 900 more hours than the German one. The average Mexican is also very family-orientated and very sociable, which results in a very connected society, a lot of joie de vivre, and a young population. This massive list of both pros and cons results in a mediocre society that never realizes its full potential, but at the same time it also never collapses into a failed state. Indeed, I will suggest that the balance of parasites to hosts is a perfectly sufficient model to explain the fortunes of almost all nations around the world. The question that is far more interesting is what leads a population to have more parasites or fewer? To be more specific, what leads a person to become either a host or a parasite? Being a host or a parasite is a decision that a person must make. What they decide will depend on their character, which is made up of 2 factors. 1, a person's temperament, which he is born with and cannot change, and 2 is a person's culture, which will shape the ideas that he both rejects and comes to accept in his life. Culture determines the malleable part of each individual character. Culture changes, and this also brings changes to the characters of individuals. The sum of all individual characters will manifest itself as changes to the national character, and in the long term, these changes will be reflected in the balance of hosts to parasites. Every single idea that is embraced by a culture will tip this balance in one way or the other. For a concrete example, let's go back to Mexico. One of the most popular genres of music in Mexico is the narcocorrido, which is a type of folk song which glorifies the tales of famous narcos. The prevalence of this type of music has led many, especially young people, in the population to admire the narcos and therefore has helped massively with the narcos recruitment efforts, leading to the drug war to get much, much worse. Of course, nobody wants to live in a society that is full of parasites, not even the parasites themselves. So this leads us to the question of how can we have more hosts and fewer parasites? How can a society improve the characters of their citizens to have more people that would rather give than take? The answer that most people will give is education, and I wholeheartedly agree. However, the quality of education also depends on the quality of the ideas being taught, and that depends on the ideas that are accepted by each individual culture. A culture with good values will lead to many hosts, few parasites, and a working society. The opposite is a culture that glorifies parasitic behavior, which, of course, will in turn lead to broken communities and failed states. What determines which values are good and which values are bad? I certainly do not have such authority. Instead, I think that it is the result that counts. If a society is weak and dysfunctional, then we can come to the conclusion that this culture created a bad national character. If a society is prosperous and achieves welfare for all of its population, then we must have to admit that it is onto something. The first problem is that we can only know this from hindsight, and that leaves us who are living like right now without a clear answer, especially when it comes to our society right now, and the problems that we are dealing with are also problems that no society before us has faced. The second problem is that the consequences of cultural changes are not always immediate and obvious, which might even take decades to become visible. For example, the consequences of the counterculture of the 1960s are only becoming clear nowadays. Some of the long-term consequences of the sexual revolution are lower fertility rates and an aging population, which will eventually lead to a pension crisis, a declining population, and economic hardship. Which invites the question, are the people that had economically productive lives and paid taxes but had no children parasites? Did these people give more than they take? Well, with a few rare exceptions, no. Their parents gave them the gift of life and they failed to pass it on. Now my generation will get slapped with the consequences. Indeed, many rich countries are staring down the barrel of demographic and economic decline and catastrophe because millions failed to give on the gift that was given to them. As harsh as this might sound, most people who are childless are by definition parasites. The boomers also normalized recreational drug use, and today we can see that this trend has definitely not stopped, but instead it has accelerated. Now the US, for example, has over 110,000 drug deaths per year on overdose and untold numbers of wrecked lives, all in the name of having a good time. I think that it would be unfair to say that all of the people who take drugs are parasites, but the vast majority of them are. And I can confidently say that more drugs equals more parasites. And here, finally, we have a trend that we cannot blame on the boomers, and that is the rise of social media. The results are just coming in, but so far they are not pretty. We know that it is addicting and that these corporations are employing the smartest people in the world just to make them more addicting, to the point that doom scrolling is literally the hobby of my generation. In fact, I think that we can also clearly see the impact of social media in the depression statistics of young people. These are only a few trends in Western societies that point to the slow tipping of the scale towards more parasites and fewer hosts. I can only speak for myself, but I really am scared of what the future will bring, and I cannot defeat this sense of dread when I see the direction that my generation is headed towards. The issue is that this is not a problem that can be solved through the scientific process, because as previously stated, it is a problem of character and therefore cannot be measured or tabulated. At the core, it is the issue of being a host or a parasite, of taking more than what you give. It is a psychological and even, dare I say, a philosophical issue. One that our society neither has the will nor the tools to treat it. We have decided that we do not care for the character of the people who make up our society. Instead, we have stated that everybody can do whatever they want as long as it does not affect me. The issue is that it does affect you. It is your society. We might think that we are all separated individuals, but we are not. No man is an island, and we are all on the same ship. If you take anything from this essay, it should be that a society is only as good as the people who compose it. I want to finish this essay with an old Greek proverb. A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit. Now tell me, are we, as a society, planting trees for our future? Are you? And if the answer is no, if you are not giving back what was given to you, then what would that make you? Thank you for your time.